On that ominous evening, as the sun was already setting over the horizon, sirens sounded in the small town. Suddenly, the peaceful atmosphere was shattered. A policeman rushing to a call did not notice a boy playing on the curb. His impact was momentary, but the consequences were devastating. This boy, full of life and dreams, was on the verge of disability. Fear, anxiety and confusion engulfed all who witnessed this horrible scene. The policeman looked at the defenseless body of the child and felt a cold sweat on his forehead. His heart clenched as he realized that he had caused this tragedy, but this was only a prelude to the real storm. When the boy's father arrived on the scene, the atmosphere changed dramatically. His eyes burned with a rage and pain that could have burned down an entire city. With every step he took toward the policeman, the tension built. What would happen when they came face to face? Could his father's words change everything? Dear viewers, it is very important for us to know you. Write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. Your presence and support really mean a lot to us. Every comment helps to promote our channel and we are grateful to each and every one of you. You are our strength and inspiration. Let's take this story apart together and see how even in the darkest of times we can find light. Enjoy the show! The wind blew through the gray morning of the small town like a harbinger of an impending storm. The cloud-covered sky seemed to reflect the dark thoughts of its inhabitants. The street lights began to flicker, as if sensing the approach of something terrible. At that moment, no one could have guessed that their world was about to change forever. On one street, away from the hustle and bustle, a black boy named Derek pedaled his old bicycle. His laughter echoed in the air like a melody that could dispel any cloud. He had no idea that on this day his childish carefree attitude would collide with a harsh reality that would turn his life upside down. At this time, nearby, in a patrol car, a policeman named Mark was tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. Absorbed in his thoughts, he was tired, irritated, and oblivious to the world around him. Lately, tensions in the city had been rising. Conflicts with the locals had become commonplace, and every time he went out on a call, it seemed to him that the situation might escalate. The words he heard from his coworkers echoed in his head. It's probably their fault. We're just doing our job. As if in answer to his inner turmoil, he received a call about strange activity in the neighborhood. Turning sharply toward the nearest street, he didn't notice Derek, who was riding by, laughing. In that instant, as the bicycle crossed his path, it was as if time stood still. First came the sound of impact, sharp, deafening. Then, silence. The passers-by froze, and Mark's heart quickened as he realized that he had just hit the boy. People gathered around, and their looks read horror. One woman covered her mouth with her hand, trying to hold back a scream. Tension hung in the air, filling the atmosphere with fear and uncertainty. Derek lay on the ground, his body lifeless. Fear and bewilderment mingled on his face, as if in slow motion. Mark jumped out of the car, his breathing heavy and his fingers shaking involuntarily. He realized that a terrible mistake had been made, but his mind could not grasp the magnitude of what had happened. Fear enveloped him, and guilt grew in his chest. The crowd was gathering, and soon voices began to be heard. Some started filming on their phones, others whispered, recounting the events and discussing the irresponsibility of the policeman. Negative glances were directed at Mark, who seemed to be completely confused. He felt isolated, as if everything around him had merged into one: judgment, hatred, dislike. At that moment, as fear and anger grew, no one knew that a new participant in this tragedy was looming on the horizon: Derek's father, who at that moment was unsuspecting. His arrival on the scene would turn into a real storm, ready to erupt at any moment. And then, when two fates collide, the story will reach a new, uncharted level of cruelty and pain. The sun was slowly rising above the horizon, coloring the sky in delicate shades of pink and orange. For Derek, however, this morning promised nothing good. He pedaled his bike happily away from the gray walls of his home, filled with constant arguments between his parents. He dreamed of freedom and adventure, not knowing that his life would soon turn into a nightmare. "Derek, where are you going?" his mother shouted from the window, wiping away her tears. She knew that her son was once again going to escape the gray of everyday life. "I'm just rolling a little," he replied without stopping, his voice full of merriment. He felt that the day was going to be special. Meanwhile, in a nearby neighborhood, police officer Mark continued to wrestle with his demons. He sat in his patrol car, rubbing his temples. Recent events had been haunting him: racial conflicts, unrelenting pressure from his superiors, and a constant sense of danger. "Hey, Mark, did you hear about the fight on the corner last night?" asked his partner, Jim, looking up from his walkie-talkie. "Once again, the locals can't figure it out. Looks like we're gonna have to break it up again." "Yes, I heard," Mark replied, trying to hide his fatigue. "There's more and more tension. I don't know how much longer we can take it." "Just do your job. Don't go any deeper." Jim shrugged. "No one wants you to be the next victim." The conversation broke off when Mark received a call. His heart beat faster when he heard suspicious activity on one of the streets. He instantly turned the ignition key and drove into the street, not realizing that this call would be fatal for him. Meanwhile, Derek passed his friend Tony, who was playing with a ball on the playground. "Hey, Derek, where are you going?" yelled Tony, throwing the ball. "I'm on an adventure," Derek replied, showing his tongue, and kept moving. As soon as the boy disappeared around the corner, his mother glanced at her watch and decided it was time to go outside again to check where she could find him. But at that moment, dark clouds covered the sky, portending trouble. Derek raced happily through the streets, but suddenly his path crossed with a patrol car coming toward him. Time stood still at that moment, and the whole world seemed to stop. "Hey, stop!" Mark shouted, slowing down, but his words didn't reach the boy's ears. He had already slowed down before he could stop. There was a deafening sound of impact, and the whole place froze in horror. Passers-by jumped out of stores and out of their cars, unable to believe their eyes. Derek was lying on the ground, and a policeman jumped out of his car, panic-stricken. Shit, what have I done?" he muttered, his hands shaking with shock. I didn't mean." A crowd began to gather, and soon people were shouting questions and accusations. "How could you? You killed him," a woman screamed, pointing at the boy. "He's just a child." Mark, unable to cope with the mounting pressure, uttered, "I didn't mean it. It was a mistake." "Mistakes shouldn't cost lives," answered someone from the crowd, their voices growing louder and louder. "You must be punished." Anxiety filled the air, and the whole atmosphere seemed to be saturated with hatred and fear. Suddenly a familiar voice was heard among the crowd. It was Derek's father, who had heard from a neighbor and was rushing to the scene. "Where is my son?" he shouted, his eyes blazing with rage. The people dispersed, opening the way as he saw his son on the ground, lying lifeless. Shouts and outrages became his background until he approached Mark. "What have you done?" His voice shook the air with hatred. "You killed my son." "I didn't mean to," Mark pleaded, but his words only seemed to add fuel to the fire. "You didn't want to? What if it had been your son?" Derek's father stood in front of him, his face contorted with anger and grief. The crowd froze. Looking at this scene, they knew that at that moment 2 lives were facing catastrophic consequences. A storm was already looming on the horizon, and the fear that gripped everyone was a harbinger that something terrible lay ahead. The sun was sinking slowly into the sunset, coloring the sky in somber shades of red and purple, as if foreshadowing an impending storm. A crowd stood around Derek. Every glance at the policeman who stood there, shocked by his act, filled the air with anger and fear. Time stood still, and everyone waited for the boy's father's reaction. "You're going to pay for this," Derek's father yelled, his voice piercing the silence like a dagger. "You think you can get away with this?" Mark, realizing that his excuses would not resonate, began to panic. He didn't know how to deal with the situation. Every word from his father sounded like a thunderclap. He had no margin for error, and he knew it, but a worry crept into his heart. What would happen next? The crowd surrounded them. Whispers and shouts could be heard. One of the passers-by commented, "He's just a kid. How could you?" Others began to support their father. "Tell him what he did. He must be held accountable." Fear clutched Mark's heart as he realized that his name would be in the spotlight, the name of the man who had run over the child, leaving him defenseless on the ground. A wave of shame and fear grew inside him, filling him to the brim. He felt like he was losing control of the situation, and like a nightmare, every step he took was on the edge. "Please calm down." Mark tried to speak, but his voice was quiet, barely audible amid the outraged shouts. He could feel the cold sweat running down his back. His hands were shaking, and his knees were weak. At that moment, sirens sounded from behind. An ambulance and additional police cars were rushing to the scene. Derek was already in the car, his life hanging in the balance, and every moment that passed brought more fear. When the ambulance stopped, The doors swung open and the medics jumped out, ready for action. Their faces were serious, professionalism shining in their eyes, but even they couldn't hide the anxiety the situation brought. One of the nurses was a woman Derek had known since childhood. She lived nearby and often asked about his progress in school. "Derek, honey, it's going to be okay," she tried to reassure him, even though she felt it could end tragically, but the boy didn't hear her words. He was on the edge of consciousness. As the medics worked, all eyes turned back to Mark. People started pulling out their phones, snapping pictures of him from different angles, as if he were the main character in a movie, only not in the way he would have wanted. His heart pounded in his chest at the realization that he was the object of hatred, not just from the crowd, but from himself. "You lost your son, and now you're going to lose everything," someone shouted, shoving him with his shoulder. Fear and hatred coalesced into a ball, and Mark felt his legs shaking. He took a step back, not knowing how to react. "What do you want from me?" he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean it. It was a mistake." The crowd erupted in anger. They did not believe his words. To them he was a symbol of cruelty, the embodiment of a system that could not protect the innocent. In that moment, fear gripped Mark as he realized that he was facing not only the hatred of the people, but also the anger he had provoked. "It's not just a mistake, it's your fault," one of the witnesses whispered hatefully, his voice full of anger. Derek was taken to the hospital, and the only thing left on the spot was the crowd, which, like waves, rolled over Mark, filling him more and more with fear. Every look, every scream became more and more threatening. He felt that he was losing himself in this mass. His inner world was collapsing, and he realized that he couldn't cope with it. Soon Derek's father, unable to bear it any longer, walked determinedly toward Mark, his eyes burning with hatred. "You will answer for this," he said, and his words were filled with tragedy. "You destroyed my life. Now I will get justice, and you will pay for everything." At that moment, fear permeated everything around them, and even the earth itself seemed to freeze in anticipation of the coming storm. A storm front was gathering all around, and not just in the sky. It was a storm that was looming over the fates of all those who found themselves in this terrible place. Dark clouds gathered over the city, threatening to rain down, as if nature itself was heralding the coming storm. Derek was in the hospital, his life on the line, and his father, standing outside, could feel the tension building with every passing second. He knew that this cop had to be dealt with and that justice had to be served. "He's black," whispered one woman in the crowd, pointing at Mark. "That's why he doesn't care about him. It's just a statistic to them." The woman's words struck the crowd like a spark in dry hay. People began to glance around, and a feeling of anger and hatred hung in the air. Everyone knew the situation wasn't just unpleasant, it was painfully familiar. Derek, like many black people in this city, faced bias and racism every day. "You all know this is no accident," someone else added, pointing at Mark. "The system that protects us is actually against us." The shouts and whistles of the crowd grew, and Mark felt his heart clench with fear. He realized that his skin, his uniform, was what gave him away in this situation. He, a police officer who had always considered himself a defender of the law, had become part of the problem. He stepped forward, trying to deal with the anger of the crowd. "I'm not a racist, I'm just a man who made a mistake," he shouted, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. How could you not see him? You're here to protect, not maim," shouted a woman with a small child in her arms. She was one of those who always suffered from prejudice. "You can't keep doing things like this and get away with it." There was a growing feeling inside Mark that he had lost control not only of the situation, but also of himself. All around him, people were discussing how racism had infiltrated every particle of their society, and he realized that this was not just a problem, it was a real scourge that touched people's lives and destiny. "Don't you realize what this means?" shouted another man who came closer. "For you, it's just a mistake. To us, it's a life. Every day we take risks, and here you are, the one who kills our children, and yet you feel innocent." Mark began to lose confidence in his words. He realized that he could not walk away from this situation, nor could he walk away from his past. His life, his choices, his biases, all became part of this tragedy. Additional police officers soon arrived on the scene and tried to calm the crowd, but instead, cries for justice grew. "Come on, don't let him get away," came a shout from the crowd. "He must answer for his actions." The screams were getting louder and louder, and it looked like someone was about to lose control. Mark stood in the center as a victim of circumstance, surrounded by anger and fear. He realized that racism, prejudice and hatred had enveloped this city, and he had become a part of it without even wanting to. At that moment, the crowd began to huddle around him. People exchanged glances full of anger and grief, and Derek's father appeared among them. His eyes, full of tears and rage, glittered in the semi-darkness. "I'm not going to let you get away with this," he shouted, moving closer to Mark. "You think you can just make excuses? You killed my son." His voice grew louder with each step, and the crowd supported him, cheering him on, repeating his words as if it were the only way to express their pain. With his head bowed, his father did not know how to survive this tragedy. Every word he spoke reflected the wound inflicted on his family, on his people. "You're a cop, and you're supposed to protect us, not kill us," he thundered, his voice resonating through the crowd. "I was in a panic. I didn't mean to." Mark tried to justify himself again, but his words were drowned out by the shouting. "You have no right to say that. You know we live in fear. You are part of the system that is destroying us," shouted someone from the crowd, and the discontent was growing. Every shout and every accusation that rang through the air became spears that pierced his soul. He felt isolated, as if the walls were shrinking and he could no longer breathe. "I want you to remember this," Derek's father whispered, his voice shaking with emotion. "You killed my son, and I will not rest until I get justice." Against this background of fear and tragedy, everything around seemed hazy. The city was plunged into chaos, and its hearts were full of pain. The racism, humiliation, and suffering of all the people gathered here were intertwined, and it was a real struggle to survive, to be heard and understood. Mark was facing an impending storm, a storm that had already begun and was ready to break. He knew that his every action would now be under a magnifying glass, and he did not know how to deal with the consequences. Two destinies had collided, and in that collision, full of fear and tragedy, was the truth, cruel and unseemly as never before. The dark clouds that gathered over the city were a symbol of the tension and anger that reigned among the crowd. Derek's father stood before Mark like a living embodiment of grief and rage, his eyes burning with hatred. He felt that time was against him, and now was his moment to hold this policeman accountable for his actions. "You think you can just walk out of here and go on with your life like nothing happened?" he shouted, his voice resonating in the air. "You killed my son, and I won't let you get away with it." The crowd, united by hatred for the policeman, slowly approached him as if they were one. They had already seen how the system had betrayed them, and now that their anger had reached its limit, it was like a storm ready to come down on everyone. "We know what you're doing," shouted someone from the crowd, his voice full of contempt. "You're defending yourself at the expense of our lives. You are nothing." Mark could feel the panic building up inside him. The words of the crowd pierced him like knives, and he didn't know how to deal with it. Images came back to his mind, images of his childhood, images of his parents who taught him to be a protector, not an oppressor. He felt his world crumbling before his eyes, and he didn't know how to stop it. "Look at him," Derek's father shouted, pointing at Mark. "Look at that cop, who doesn't feel any guilt. He doesn't even realize what he's done." The crowd responded to his words with anger and hatred, and suddenly one of the men lunged forward, his face contorted with rage. "You bastard, I want you to answer for your actions." He ran at Mark, his hands clenched into fists, ready to strike. "You think you're going to walk around here with a clear conscience, like you're innocent?" The situation had heated up to the limit, and Mark, realizing he couldn't stand still any longer, stepped back. He tried to find words, but they stuck in his throat like shards of glass. He realized that his life would never be the same, but the fear and hatred that surrounded him seemed overwhelming. "You're nothing. You are nothing," the man continued, his voice echoing in the air. "You think your uniform will protect you? We know what you really are." Mark felt his knees weaken and he collapsed to the ground, unable to stand any longer. At that moment he became a victim of his own actions. He had no strength to justify himself, and his face showed total defeat. "Look at him," shouted a woman from the crowd, pointing at Mark. "He knows what he's done. He knows he's a murderer." The crowd, feeling more powerful than ever, began to shout. It wasn't just an expression of anger, it was an opportunity to regain power. Every shout, every curse became instruments of vengeance, and they hurled them toward Mark like arrows. "You'll never be able to escape your past," the woman hissed, her eyes glittering. "You will carry this shame for the rest of your life." Mark was trapped, his body trembling with fear and shame. He realized that he himself had become part of this cruel system that betrayed people. His hands were bound by his own fear, and he did not know how to get out of this situation. "You don't deserve to be a cop," Derek's father shouted, his voice breaking with emotion. "You don't deserve to wear that uniform." As the crowd continued to grow, one of the men, full of rage, stepped forward. He came up to Mark and looked him in the eye and said, "You will pay for this, and I will witness your shame." At that moment, Mark felt his soul tearing up. He realized that he couldn't walk away from the shame. His inner world was cracking like glass, and he didn't know how to stop it. People started pulling out their phones to capture the moment. Their gazes were full of contempt, as if they were in a stadium watching a game where one of the players was clearly losing. Every scream, every humiliation became agony for him, and he himself became a target for the anger that should have been directed at the system but instead fell on his shoulders. Soon there were sounds of approaching cars. It was the police, who should have been protecting him, but instead they were part of this violent picture. Mark looked at the faces of his colleagues, and on their faces he saw something that horrified him: fear, hatred, uncertainty. These were people who used to be his friends, but now they had become his enemies. "What's going on here?" one of the officers asked, coming closer. "He killed a child," shouted someone from the crowd. "He doesn't deserve to be here." Mark, on his knees, realized that his world had collapsed. In that moment, he realized that people's anger would not be quenched until he answered for his actions. And it would not just be an answer, it would be revenge. It would be a humiliation that he would remember for the rest of his life. The anger of the crowd was becoming as fierce as a hurricane raging in the desert. The people gathered around Mark felt united in one goal: to get the justice they had been waiting for. They were ready to sweep away everything in their path. And Mark, on his knees before their hatred, became their target. "Look at him!" shouted one of the men, his voice cutting through the air. "Look at him begging for mercy. Do you think he will show the same pity for our children?" Mark, realizing that his life and career were now in jeopardy, felt the adrenaline leave and cold panic take its place. He looked into people's eyes, and they reflected what he himself had once been unwilling to see: a hatred that could destroy. "You always look down on us," the other man continued, his face contorted with anger. "You don't understand what it means to be black in this city. We live in fear, and you beat us like we're trash." The shouting became louder and louder, and suddenly one of the crowd members, clearly under the influence of his emotions, jumped forward and pushed Mark. He fell to the ground, and that was the beginning of the real violence. People began to step forward, hatred overflowing in their hearts, and they did not want to be left behind. "How dare you be here, you bastard!" shouted the man, his fist clutching Mark by the collar. "We won't let you get away with this." The crowd became aggressive. Some began to tear out a sign with his uniform on it. Others shouted racist slurs, each phrase sharper than the last. At that moment, racism became more than just an expression of hatred. It became a symbol of their pain, and Mark became the living embodiment of that pain. "He's black," shouted one of the women. "You're all like him. You always oppress us." The hatred grew, and soon one of the men, unable to contain his emotions, stepped forward, ready for action. In his hand was a piece of wood he had plucked from a nearby fence. "Look, he thinks he can get away with it," he shouted, waving the tree. "We'll make sure he remembers us." Mark felt his heart pounding in unison with the screams, and he stared in horror at that piece of wood, ready to smash his face in. He knew it wouldn't end there. This was only the beginning. "I'm not a racist," he shouted, but his words were swallowed up by the screams of the crowd. "I want to change everything. I didn't want to hurt anyone." But someone in the crowd, hearing his words, only grinned. "You're a typical cop," he shouted. "You've always protected white people and oppressed us. You don't know what's going on." At that moment, the man with the tree, unable to restrain himself, struck Mark. The blow was brutal, and the sound was like splintering wood. Mark cried out in pain. His body stiffened, and he fell to the ground. Pain shot through him and he tried to get up, but he couldn't. He felt the world around him begin to darken, as if his life was slipping away. "Look at him!" someone shouted as Mark, crouched on the ground, tried to take cover from more blows. "He's finally getting what he deserves." The crowd, enraged, began to attack him, each man contributing his share of hatred and humiliation. The blows came one after the other. and their eyes burned with a desire for revenge. "Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be in our shoes?" one of them shouted, bitterness in his voice. "You will never feel our pain, but today you will know what fear is." As the first blow rained down on his face, Mark couldn't believe his life would end like this. With each new attack, he realized that all his hopes and dreams of how he could make a difference had vanished into thin air. He had no defense, and he didn't know what to do. The crowd erupted into shouts, and suddenly one of the women shouted, "We have to stop him," she shrieked, coming toward Mark. "We can't let him get away with this." But others supported the humiliation. "Let him suffer," someone shouted, pushing her back. "He deserves it." Shadows circled above Mark's head, and he heard someone in the crowd say his name, turning him into an object of scorn. "Mark, do you think you can hide from your guilt?" came a voice full of hatred. "You are a symbol of the system that is destroying us." With each blow, with each scream of hatred, he felt his soul drain away. Images rose in his mind, images of how he had once dreamed of being a protector, how he had been full of hope, but now he was part of this chaos, part of this darkness that was consuming him. "You will be our example," someone whispered as the crowd, heated with hatred, continued to beat him. "You will remember this day forever." At this moment, Mark realized that all of this was more than just anger. This was a fight for justice that had long been abandoned, and in the eyes of the people he saw not only hatred but also the pain they carried in their hearts. "Today you will be part of our history," one of the men said as they continued their attack, "and I hope you will remember us when you are in prison, and your thoughts will be about how you destroyed our lives." The hatred was stronger than ever, and in that moment Mark realized that he had become a hostage not only to his mistake, but to everything that mistakes symbolize. Mark lay on the ground, feeling the rage and hatred of the crowd turn into an actual physical blow. Each new blow was like a bolt of lightning piercing his body and mind. He didn't know how long it would last, but voices rang in his head, the voices of his parents, teachers and friends who had once taught him to be a defender of the law, to uphold justice and protect those in need. But where was that justice now? "Did you think you could beat us with impunity?" the angry voice came, and Mark opened his eyes to see the face of a man who was ready to finish what had begun. Like waking from a long nightmare, he remembered Derek, how his life had been shattered in an instant. The unspeakable pain he had caused that boy came back to him in the form of bitterness and shame. He tried to get up, but his legs gave out and he fell to the ground again. "You're a cop, aren't you?" someone shouted above him, his voice resonating in the darkness. "You were supposed to protect us, not humiliate us." "Please, I didn't mean it," Mark said, his words full of despair. "I was just doing my job." The crowd, as if that was a signal, grew even more heated. Every time he tried to justify himself, the hatred only grew. "Work?" another voice, full of contempt, echoed. "You think this is just a job? It's a life you've ruined. You didn't just make a mistake, you chose to be on the side of oppression." His words cut Mark painfully. He realized that this moment was his awakening, and what he had done would haunt him for the rest of his life. Every humiliation, every attempt to justify himself was a reminder of what he had lost: trust, respect, perhaps even his humanity. "How many more children are you going to break?" the man hissed, his voice breaking with rage. "How many more innocent lives are you going to destroy?" Mark felt tears fill his eyes. He could no longer ignore the fact that his actions had led to tragedy. This terrible incident, which had seemed to him just part of his job, had turned out to be a personal disaster. "I don't know how to fix this," he shouted, trying desperately to reach the crowd. "I didn't know what was going to happen." But his words, full of remorse, did not resonate. Instead, they were just another proof of his weakness, his inability to understand the reality in which he existed. "Do you think you have a right to regret?" came the woman's muffled voice. "You can't even imagine what it's like to live with these scars you've left behind." The screams, rage and hatred continued to build like a tornado, threatening to swallow everything in its path. Each blow, each taunt plunged him into a dark abyss, and he realized he could not escape responsibility for his actions. No excuse could save him. Suddenly he saw Derek's face in front of him, his eyes full of fear and pain. A whisper of memories rang in Mark's head, the boy's laughter, his hopes and dreams. He saw his world falling apart, and he himself became part of that destruction. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Derek," he cried out, as if he hoped his words would reach the boy's heart. I wanted to help." But Derek's voice in his mind wouldn't shut up. "You killed me," It sounded like betrayal. You betrayed me and everyone who trusted you. Mark felt his heart breaking. He realized that he had lost not only Derek, but his entire life. He had become part of the system that had oppressed others for so long, and now he himself was trapped. The crowd did not relent. Their faces became unrecognizable. Full of anger and hatred, they surrounded him like a pack of predators ready to attack. "We will not be silent any longer," someone shouted. "We will fight." And in that moment, Mark realized that this moment was more than just his test. It was a struggle for truth, a struggle to end inequality and oppression, and though he himself was at the center of that struggle, he knew that ultimately it had to be about Derek and all those who had suffered at his hands. "If I have to answer for my actions, I'm ready," he said, though his voice sounded hoarse. "I'm willing to accept the consequences." With each word he spoke, he felt the darkness that had enveloped him begin to dissolve. He was finally beginning to realize that real strength was not in wearing a uniform, but in admitting his mistakes and striving to change. "The choice is yours," he said, looking into the eyes of the crowd, full of bitterness and understanding. "But I can no longer be what I was. I want to change the system we live in." In that moment, he felt that the passion with which he spoke was finally awakening hope in people. Hope for change, hope for justice, hope that even after all they had been through, they could start over. The crowd, like a living organism, continued to rage around Mark, their fury growing like a storm, ready to attack anything in its path. Each blow he received wasn't just physical, they were blows to his conscience, his sense of self, his very essence. They were sawing at him from the inside, like a hammer smashing a rock into small pieces. His hands clenched into fists as someone in the crowd drove a fingernail into his shoulder with force, leaving a deep mark. The pain pierced him like a fire, engulfing every cell in his body. He couldn't dodge, couldn't run away. This was the revenge that kept rolling over him in waves, taking away all his hopes and dreams. Someone, realizing their power, had decided that he would become a symbol of their hatred. He stepped closer, and Mark felt fear settle in his heart. The feeling was becoming more and more unbearable with each passing second. There was no compassion in the eyes of those around him, only revenge. Suddenly one of the men, losing patience, kicked him. It wasn't just cruel, it was merciless. Mark, not yet fully aware of what was happening, had no time to react. The pain pierced him, and he fell to the ground like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Blood rushed from his mouth, leaving a bitter metallic taste mixed with the bitterness of his own regrets. He didn't know how much time had passed, but in that moment the world around him became blurred, as if in a fog. The faces of people he had once seen as part of the law were now distorted masks of hatred. The crowd, like hunters on their prey, moved in concert. Every blow was honed, every attack precise. They knew what they were doing, and they enjoyed it. It wasn't just violence, it was cleansing, the redemption they'd been hoping for so long. Every time Mark tried to get up, he was knocked to the ground again. They weren't leaving him a chance. They were turning him into an object of humiliation, a symbol of what had happened to Derek and so many others. Mark felt a dark abyss in his soul, ready to consume him. The pain was becoming unbearable, and he realized that his physical condition only reflected his inner world. He was no longer a policeman protecting the law. He was a prisoner of his own actions, and that truth haunted him. His legs wouldn't listen, his body weakened, and he could no longer hold back the screams that burst from his chest. Every sound he made echoed his fear and despair, but no one listened. His voice drowned in the thunder of hatred like a ship in a stormy sea. Tears flowed down his cheeks, mixing with dirt and blood, leaving traces of his hopelessness on his face. He realized that these people were not just taking revenge, they were fighting for their lives, for their freedom, for the possibility to exist without fear. And in that realization he felt the deepest irony. He himself had become part of what they hated, and now it had become his curse. Someone in the crowd, seeing his helplessness, decided to intensify his suffering. He grabbed a stick and hit Mark's back with it with force. The pain pierced him and he fell again, unable to resist. His body was broken and his soul was broken. Each blow took away not only his strength, but also his ability to hope for salvation. It was quiet for a moment, and he felt the sharp pain fade away, giving way to a cold indifference. He could no longer fight, no longer beg for mercy. This moment was the end of him, not only as a policeman, but as a human being. As the darkness enveloped him, he realized that perhaps this pain was the only way he could be punished. In that instant, he realized that his life had been based on false notions of power and control. Real power was not in hitting and humiliating, but in the ability to admit his mistakes and find ways to redeem himself. But now, as he lay on the ground, his consciousness slowly slipping away, he realized that redemption had become an unattainable ideal. He was lost in the vast shadows of his darkness. Darkness gradually enveloped Mark's consciousness, and he found himself in a space devoid of time and place. The pain of his body became part of this dark environment, reminding him that he was still alive. As if from far away, he heard muffled sounds, screams, cries of anger and hatred that blended into a single cacophony. There was no peace in them, only rage demanding an outlet. He tried to open his eyes, but the light coming through the veil of darkness was blinding. He squinted and saw the faces of the people who looked at him with hatred, as if he were a ghost returning from hell. Every look, every wrinkle in his forehead seemed to be a foreshadowing of his inevitable fate. He realized that he could no longer remain an idle observer of his fate. This chaos that surrounded him had become his prison. Slowly his perception of the world began to return to normal, and he felt his body responding to the signals of pain. His arms and legs were battered, every joint a reminder that he was not just a victim. He had become part of a system that epitomized inequality, suffering, and cruelty. And though his physical condition was terrible, deep down he knew that the real fight was still ahead of him. Gradually, as if someone was pushing him to action, he tried to rise, but his body would not yield. Shouts and reproaches continued to rain down on him, and every word was like a knife edge. He had hit rock bottom, and now he was about to realize how deep was the abyss into which he had fallen. The crowd, as if sensing his attempt to break free, grew with renewed vigor. One of them, still enraged, grabbed him by the collar and yanked him toward him. Mark felt himself being pulled against him, and he was once again face to face with this whirlwind of hatred. He knew this was no time for weakness. His brain began to work, processing the memories of what had happened. He remembered how he himself had become part of this cruel system, how his actions had changed the lives of so many people forever. That memory pierced him like an arrow, leaving behind a feeling of emptiness. He wasn't just a cop, he had become a symbol of oppression. And suddenly, as if in answer to his inner torment, Derek's voice echoed in his head. "You don't realize what you've done." As if echoing in his mind, this voice, full of pain and fear, was the cause of his inner conflict. He tried to get up, to try to distract himself from reality, but nothing worked. His body refused to obey. Meanwhile, the crowd surrounded him again, their faces contorted in horrible grimaces. Each blow was like a reminder that they were the ones who had suffered. They were people who had lost everything they had, and now their hatred was becoming an excuse. Each new humiliation became more and more brutal. One of the men lifted his foot and kicked Mark in the head with all his might. His head snapped to the side, and the darkness began to consume his consciousness again. He felt the world fade away, leaving only the ominous whispers of his past. Many questions swirled in his mind. How could he have been so wrong? How could he be so blind to the suffering of others? But now that his body was battered and his soul was almost lost, he realized he could no longer just give up. He had to seek redemption. But it was in this chaos, amidst the rage and pain, that he felt something begin to change. He remembered that despite his mistakes, he was still human, and there was hope in his heart. He tried to gather his strength to rise up, to show everyone that he was not broken. And suddenly, amid the rage and hatred, a spark flashed in him, a spark of understanding. He could not change what had happened, but he could try to change himself. In that instant, he realized that every one of these people around him was ready to fight for justice, and if he could atone for his sins, perhaps he could regain a modicum of respect. Gaining courage, he finally opened his mouth and made a sound, not a scream, but a sound full of pain, but at the same time full of sincere remorse. He was ready for the consequences, ready for this to be his redemption. He was ready to be the one willing to fight for change, even if it meant coming face to face with the fury of those he had once considered enemies. Mark, despite his physical weakness, felt the desire to change his fate brewing inside him. He could no longer be a mere victim of circumstances. He had to become an active participant in the process. Everything around him continued to spin in a whirlwind of hatred, but hope blossomed in his heart. As soon as he looked up again, he noticed that some of the people in the crowd had stopped, looking at him with curiosity rather than hatred. This new reaction was an inspiration to him. Perhaps among these people were those who were also suffering from the system he represented. He knew that change was only possible through understanding and dialogue. He, slowly rising to his feet, felt everyone's eyes on him. At that moment, as the world around him became more and more tense, he shrank back and gathered his last strength. Determination blazed in his soul, and he spoke, albeit quietly, "I realize what I've done. I've realized my mistake, and I'm ready to work on myself." These words, spoken with such feeling, awakened anticipation in the crowd. Some, exchanging glances, began to whisper among themselves. Not all the faces continued to express hatred. Some of them began to show interest in what he was going to say next. Mark felt the inner shackles that had been restraining him begin to loosen. He kept talking, and his voice became more and more confident. "I know I can't erase the pain I've caused. I can't bring Derek back. I can't bring back the life I broke. But I want to change the way I live, the way I serve." Gathering his wits, he added, "I want to help you. I want to hear your stories, your suffering. I want to be your ally, not your enemy. Let's work together to change the system that oppresses us." The crowd froze in anticipation, as if struck by the unexpected sincerity of his words. Mark continued, feeling the tension in the air begin to fade, giving way to a new dynamic. He saw in the people's eyes not only hatred, but a hunger for change. He realized that he could not do it alone, and his call could be the first step toward dialogue. Quiet voices resounded among the crowd. People began to share their stories, taking a step toward openness despite the brutality they had experienced. Each of them was ready to talk about their suffering, how the system had destroyed their lives, how they had lost their loved ones, friends, and hopes for the future. Mark, on the verge of falling, felt his own pain being filled with meaning. He became part of the process, not only as a police officer, but as a human being seeking understanding and redemption. Each story, each tear that fell to the ground, brought him closer to the realization real strength lies in the ability to hear, see, and feel. One woman in the crowd, with eyes full of tears, raised her voice. She spoke of how she had lost her son to police brutality. Her words were filled with grief, but also with determination. She was looking for justice, looking to change a system that betrayed her and so many others. Like a chain reaction, others began to share their stories. Each new life, each new loss, revived a sense of unity in their hearts. Hatred began to fade into the background, giving way to the understanding they had long sought. Gradually, Mark realized that although he himself stood on the edge of the abyss, he could also be the one to lend a helping hand. He could be the bridge between the police and those who were suffering from the brutality. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but now that he saw people opening up, he felt that this initiative could make a difference. When he gathered his courage, he raised his hand and asked the crowd to be silent. When all eyes were on him again, he said, "I know that words cannot bring back what you have lost. But I am ready to be a part of your movement. Together, let's change what has hurt us for so long. Together we can create a new reality." As if energized by his energy, the crowd began to gather around him and a spark of hope was lit in their hearts. They witnessed how one mistake can lead to change, how even in dark times a path to light can be found. This moment was a turning point, not only for Mark, but for all those who were suffering and looking for an opportunity for change. They stood together, and though their bodies were tortured, their spirits were stronger. Together they began the journey towards change, step by step, towards justice and understanding. With every word Mark spoke, a wave of unity grew in the crowd. It was an amazing feeling. Everyone who had once been enemies now seemed to begin to realize that there was much more that united them than divided them. Every look of hatred and fear began to soften, and a new hope was in the air. Mark stood in front of these people, among them, and felt his own soul fill with light. He felt that his words, his intentions, had finally resonated in the hearts of these people. They were willing to listen to him and perhaps give him a chance at redemption. One of the men, who had just risen from the ground where he had been beaten, stepped forward and, meeting Mark's eyes, spoke, "You talk about change. How can we be sure you're not just another liar trying to make us feel better?" The words sounded like a challenge, and Mark realized they were full of truth. He couldn't demand trust without reason. But he wasn't going to back down. Too many people had been hurt, and he was ready to take responsibility. He took a deep breath and answered, "I don't expect you to believe me. But I'm ready to act. I will be with you. I will work to change the system. I know it's a long road, but I'm ready to take the first step. I am here to serve you, not against you." Mark's words sounded sincere, and it was beginning to have an effect. Other people began to approach him, their faces expressing not only anger but also confusion. They seemed to be searching for an answer to the question of whether they could really believe what he was saying. Among them was the same woman who had lost her son. She came closer, her eyes full of tears, but there was no longer anger in them. Instead, there was curiosity and a desire to understand. "If you really want change, what are you going to do? How are you going to undo what you have done?" This question was a turning point. It was sincere, and it felt the need for real action. Mark knew he couldn't offer simple solutions, but he could start small. "I propose to create a group where we can discuss our problems, our fears, and our hopes. I am willing to work with you, to listen to your stories, and to look for ways to change the system from within. We must work together to break this vicious cycle." These words again caused a storm of emotion. People started talking, exchanging glances, and at one point someone in the crowd shouted, "We should organize a rally. Let's draw attention to what's going on." This idea started gaining momentum, and soon they started discussing how they could gather more people, how to get their ideas to the authorities, how to unite their voices. They talked about how important it is to be heard, how important it is to create public opinion. At this time Mark realized that he had become not only a participant but also a leader. At first he felt a sense of anxiety, but soon it gave way to confidence. He could feel the sincerity of his intentions penetrating the hearts of these people. The more they discussed, the more ideas they came up with. They talked about creating joint programs to improve police-community relations, the need for police training, and the importance of listening to the stories of those they protect. With every word, with every idea that was born in that circle, Mark felt his own desire for redemption grow. He couldn't bring back the lives that had been lost, but he could work for a future that was better. He could be the spark that would light the fire of change. But he knew it wouldn't be an easy road. Fears were stirring inside him that it might all end in disappointment, that the system would be too strong to be changed. However, he also realized that right now, in this moment, there were people gathered around him who were ready to fight for their rights, for their votes, for their lives. They were ready to act. As the meeting ended and people began to disperse, Mark felt that this night was the beginning of something bigger. He stood among them, and while he realized that there was still a long road to redemption, he also knew that he now had support. These men were his comrades in arms, and together they could change not only their own destiny, but the fate of an entire community. Mark looked up at the night sky, full of stars, and felt hope begin to ignite in his heart again. He wasn't just a cop anymore, he was part of a movement, part of change, and with those around him, he was ready to begin this new journey. The next morning Mark awoke with renewed determination, but an uneasy feeling was brewing in his heart. Despite the success of the previous night, a shadow of fear lingered in his mind. He knew that change was as much about hope as it was about risk, a risk that could lead to more suffering. The encounter with the crowd remained in his memory as a bright moment, but he also realized that this light could be extinguished at any moment. The system he represented was not going to just give up. He realized that his path to redemption would not be an easy one, and the fear that he would once again find himself in the role of oppressor haunted him. At work, the atmosphere had changed. Mark was not taken seriously by his fellow policemen, and he could sense their dislike. Their looks of doubt and discontent became more and more obvious. They did not understand his desire for change, and he did not know how to explain to them that this was not just a moment of weakness, but a conscious choice. "You've become one of them, Mark," one of his older comrades growled as they met in the hallway. "You betrayed us. Do you think you can talk to these people? They're just a mob ready for violence." The words echoed in his mind, and he felt a chill go through his heart. For a moment, it seemed to him that his quest for change was doomed to failure. But then he remembered that night, the genuine connection he had felt with the people, and it gave him strength. However, despite his inner resolve, anxiety was growing. That day, a tragic incident occurred that was a turning point. There was a confrontation between police and protesters in the city that quickly spiraled out of control. Mark was on duty and was forced to participate in the suppression of the rally. Through the noise of screams and whistles, he tried to find a moment to intervene, to tell his colleagues that they should be careful, that people did not want violence. He knew that each of these people was suffering, and they were not the enemy, but his voice was lost among the murmuring, and all he could do was watch. At that moment, something terrible happened. One of the police officers, driven by rage and confusion, use force against a protester who seemed to just want to make a point. Mark felt his heart sink when he saw the guy, just a teenager, fall to the ground. He was shocked when he realized that the teenager was the same black boy he had met at the meeting. The crowd's screams turned to panic, and everyone on the scene began to huddle around to help the injured man. Mark, gripped by fear and anger, rushed towards the guy, but his path was blocked by the other police officers. They didn't want him to get involved, and he felt a sense of hopelessness overwhelm him. "You can't save him," one of his coworkers said, pushing him back. "He's just shit. He and his parents will never change." Those words hurt Mark deeply. He saw the boy's life he had known slipping away with every passing moment. The question swirling in his mind was, how can we let this happen? He realized that this wasn't just his fight. It was a fight for all those affected by the system. The crowd, full of anger and fear, began throwing objects in the direction of the police. Shouts and whispers mixed with a sense of utter despair. Mark, unable to contain his anger, turned to his colleagues. "We can't do this. These people have a right to life, to a voice." But his words were met with deafening silence. All he saw in response was indifference, and it finally broke him. A sense of hopelessness ripened inside him. He had become part of this system, part of something he hated. Finally, the shrieks huddled around them intensified and the incident turned into a veritable massacre. Mark felt his strength leaving him as he saw the police brutalizing the protesters again. This horror was repeated over and over again until he saw the police's mean blows crushing everything around him. Finally, he saw a familiar face among the protesters. It was the mother of the teenager who had been beaten, trying to fight her way through the crowd to reach her son, her cries sounding like a call for help. This picture pierced him to the core. He realized that this was the moment he had to do something. Gathering all his strength, he burst through the crowd. His legs moved as if they were made for this one purpose, to help. He approached his mother and grabbed her shoulder, trying to calm her down. "We'll help him, I promise." But her face was contorted with horror, and she looked at him with despair. "How can you promise? You're part of the system. You don't know what it is to suffer." Her words pierced him like sharp knives. In that moment he felt the weight of his past, the hopelessness of it all. He wasn't just a cop. He was a symbol of fear, a symbol of the power that destroyed lives. And in that moment, as he looked into her eyes, he realized that no words could redeem him. Clutching his head, he fell to his knees, unable to hold back his tears. He realized that, if only for a moment, he had to take her side. This incident was his personal tragedy, and he knew that this moment would leave an indelible mark on his soul. Every breath, every tear, every cry was part of what he would now carry on his shoulders. When it seemed to him that the whole world was crumbling, he realized that this was not the end. It was the beginning of his inner struggle, his journey to redemption. He had to change not only his life, but also the lives of others. And in that moment, despite all the pain and tragedy, he felt a spark of hope rekindle in his heart. Mark, still on his knees, felt the world around him disintegrate. Screams, anger and despair became part of his new reality. He watched the crowd of protesters turn into a grim mass full of fear and hatred. Suddenly he was gripped by the feeling that this night could be not just a tragedy for him and everyone present, but a truly catastrophic event that could leave an indelible mark on the city's history. While Mark was trying to find the strength to get up, he realized that tension was building among the policemen standing in line. They sensed that the situation was getting out of control, and it made them want to use force, but this time he could not let that happen. As if sensing the coming storm, he jumped to his feet, his heart pounding like never before. He rushed to his colleagues, trying to warn them that they were on the verge of disaster. "Look, if you don't stop, this could end horribly," he shouted, trying to change their minds, but all he heard in response was mockery. "What, Mark? Are you going to side with these street thugs?" said one of the policemen, laughing. "Do you think that will help?" Mark felt anger overwhelm him, but he knew that this anger would not lead to good. He gathered his courage and tried to raise his voice above the general rumble. "We must understand them. They are suffering. They are not enemies. They are our brothers and sisters." But his words were drowned in the noise, and he saw the tension rising. Suddenly there was an explosion in the crowd of protesters. It was like a portent that a real storm was gathering on the horizon. It wasn't a physical explosion, but an explosion of emotion that erupted when people realized that their discontent had escalated into a real threat. Mark noticed the fear and uncertainty beginning to spread among the police officers. Many had shields and batons behind their backs, but their eyes reflected panic. Some of them exchanged worried glances, realizing that their actions could cause tragedy. But like lava, a raging fury began raging among them. One of the policemen, who had lost control, struck one of the protesters with his baton. The blow ripped the air, and everything around him instantly froze. Mark felt his blood boil with terror. He rushed forward to stop it, but it was too late. Screams and moans could be heard through the crowd. People began to panic, and this became a catalyst for violence. Suddenly, the entire ranks of the police shook, and one of the groups, driven by bloodlust, rushed to attack the protesters. The scene turned into chaos. The noise, the screams, the sound of breaking windows all merged into one deafening roar. Mark, gripped by fear, tried to find a way out of this abyss. He knew that at any moment this could become a tragedy that could not be undone. He saw the police officers, surrounded by their fury, begin to beat the protesters without any regret. At that moment, he saw another acquaintance in distress. It was the same teenager he had met at the last meeting. He was lying on the ground, surrounded by a pile of police officers. Something broke inside him. Fear, anger, and regret blended into one, turning him into an invisible bomb ready to explode. In that moment, he realized that if he didn't stop this violence, it could end in disaster. His head was spinning with thoughts of what he had to do. He realized that fear was not only what the protesters were experiencing, it was a fear that nested in him, and he had to get rid of it. Mark tried to scream again, gathering all the strength in his lungs. "Stop! This is not a solution. We don't have to hurt each other." But his voice was lost in the chaos, and no one heard him. All around him there was carnage. Screams of pain and despair filled the air, and he felt himself losing control of the situation with every passing moment. It wasn't just a fight, it was a real apocalypse, tearing the world apart. The crowd of protesters, frightened, began to scatter, but among them were those who remained standing, ready to fight to the end. This was their last chance. They could not give up, because their lives, their futures and the lives of their children depended on this moment. Their courage reminded Mark of what he was fighting for, but his own helplessness brought him back to reality. He was trapped between his duty as a police officer and his desire for justice. Suddenly he saw one of the policemen waving a baton and walking towards him. It was the end of his inner struggle. Tears came to his eyes, and he felt his heart clench with fear. He had to make a choice, either become part of the violence or try to stop it. Mark stood in the way of the policeman. He knew that his actions could lead to unpredictable consequences, but in that moment he realized, if he didn't stop this now, he wouldn't be able to live with himself anymore. He raised his hands, trying to stop his colleague. "Stop! We don't have to!" But words were useless. The policeman, driven by rage and hatred, lashed out at him, and in that moment Mark realized that the fear he had felt was now a part of himself. His own story was turning into a tragedy, and he knew that it would be followed by a new wave of violence that would consume everyone on this battlefield. Through the chaos, moaning, and pain came a loud, piercing scream that was a mixture of fear and despair. In that second, he realized that everything he had tried to prevent was now his own personal nightmare, and that nightmare was just beginning. An alarming hum echoed around him like a deafening orchestra of chaos. Mark felt his heart pounding in unison with the screams and groans. The situation was becoming more unmanageable with each passing second. He couldn't see where this night was going, but he sensed that this was only the beginning of the real nightmare. The shouts of the protesters mingled with cries of pain, and the very air seemed to be saturated with passion and rage. The crowd, previously full of determination, was now fleeing in panic, but there were still those who would not give up. Their eyes burned with determination, and that gave strength to Mark, who was still struggling with himself. When the policeman who lunged at him swung his baton, Mark instinctively ducked. A confrontation was inevitable, but he realized that if he didn't, he could become part of the violence he was trying so hard to stop. A real struggle had broken out around him. Everyone wanted to defend their truth, but the price was high. Suddenly, he saw one of the protesters, a young man with anger in his eyes, run forward and confront the police officer. That moment was a turning point. The teenager's outrage sparked a wave of courage in the crowd. People began to gather around, ready to defend each other. Mark felt a sense of hope overwhelm him. Perhaps they could make a difference if they united. "Stop!" the teenager shouted, balling his fists. "We are not the enemy. We're here to fight for our lives." But the policeman, who had lost control, only pushed the young man aside. Mark, realizing that this could lead to more violence, could not stay away. He rushed forward, trying to stop his colleague. "Don't touch him, he didn't do anything." His voice was torn with anger and pain, but his words were lost again in the rumble of rage. It seemed that violence was already part of their DNA. Every blow, every scream was a reminder of how deeply rooted this separation was. Pain and suffering were becoming habitual, and Mark realized that they might not be able to escape this darkness. He rushed towards the crowd again, trying to convince the protesters to step back to avoid bloodshed. His voice trailed off as he saw one of his colleagues turn a blind eye to the whole situation. It was like madness. The police officers, as if fascinated, were losing all sense of humanity. At that moment, everything around them erupted as if the world around them had exploded. The sound of thunder rolling overhead was a symbol of utter destruction. Mark felt his hopes and dreams crumble before his eyes. He knew that unless he took decisive action, he would be part of this violence forever. The adrenaline rush invigorated him, and he remembered his promise. He had to protect everyone caught up in this terrible conflict. He raised his hands, as if trying to stop the carnage. "This shouldn't be happening. We're supposed to be here for each other," he shouted, turning to his colleagues. But instead of understanding, he saw only mocking smiles. One of the policemen, caught up in the frenzy of the moment, came up to him and said, "You've gotten too soft. Mark, there's no room for pity. You're either with us or against us." Those words, like a knife, pierced him. He felt his faith waver. He did not know how much longer he could bear it. The darkness of the night enveloped him like a fog, and fear took hold of him again. Every step he took brought him closer to the edge of the abyss where fear turned into terror. A real massacre began before his eyes. The police, given to rage, began to disperse the crowd, sparing no one. Every blow of the baton, every scream became part of their common tragedy. Loads of people fell to the ground, and soon a ferocious scene was around Mark. Fear, anger, hatred all blended into one mad symphony, and he realized that this could be the end. Despite the pain and anger, a spark of hope flickered in his heart. He began to realize that this darkness could not consume him completely. He had to fight not only with those around him, but also with himself. A decision crept into his mind. He could no longer be a silent observer. He had to become the one to change this situation. Gathering his courage, he rushed toward the protesters again, pushing his way through the chaos. Every second seemed to turn into an eternity, and he felt that he was responsible not only for his own actions, but also for the fate of those who remained with him. He couldn't wait any longer, couldn't stand by while his brothers and sisters suffered. With each step he realized that unless he changed his fate, he would lose his humanity. He could no longer afford to remain part of a system that refused to see the people in front of them. Mark felt rage fill his soul. He had to make a choice, either continue to give in to fear and hatred, or fight for justice and equality. He was no longer the cop he used to be. This night had changed him, and he knew that no matter how hard it was, he had to choose the path that would possibly lead him to redemption. And with that decision, he stepped into the darkness, determined to be the one to change the course of history. Darkness enveloped the streets, and the sounds of chaos grew louder. The thunderclaps in the sky reflected the storm raging in the hearts of the people, and each explosion of anger pierced the night. Mark made his way through the crowd, sensing the growing tension and confusion. Every minute seemed like an eternity, and he knew he was running out of time. His heart was pounding in unison with the noise around him, but now he could feel a new desire igniting in him, a desire to change everything that was happening. He realized that the actions of his colleagues were undermining their authority and the public's trust, and this was a trait he could no longer ignore. You can't stand by when kindness and humanity are threatened. Mark soon came upon a group of protesters who, despite their fear, had no intention of retreating. Their faces were determined and their eyes glittered like fire. He stepped closer, trying to tune into their wave. "We must unite," he said, his voice full of energy. "Don't let fear consume you. We can change this." The protesters' faces reflected his eagerness. They began to raise their hands, preparing to speak out against the violence. At that moment, he noticed among them the young man who had recently become a symbol of resistance. The young man looked at him with hope, and that gave Mark confidence. Suddenly, police officers appeared on the horizon. Their eyes glittered with aggression, and they seemed ready to use all their force to quell the protests. As they approached, the crowd stretched their hands toward the sky, as if waiting for help from above. Mark felt the fear overwhelm him. He had to stop it before it was too late. Suddenly he screamed, trying to block out the hum of the world around him. "We're here to protect each other. We are not enemies." In response, he heard indistinct cries of fear and doubt. He realized that the gap between them, the police and the protesters, was becoming more and more tangible. Every step, every second, brought them closer to the moment when the conflict could turn into a real massacre. The police squad lined up, their shields gleaming under the bright light. One of the officers, whom Mark knew from his early years in the service, stepped forward, and his menacing voice echoed through the crowd. "Disperse! We have orders to disperse this cluster." These words made Mark even more afraid. He knew they could be followed by brutal violence, and every moment of delay could be his last. He couldn't let that happen. "Please! We're not looking to cause trouble. We just want to be heard," he exclaimed, addressing both his colleagues and the protesters. He saw the teenager's hopeful look again, and it filled him with determination. The crowd grew more tense. There were whispers and dissenting voices, but Mark could not afford to give up. He kept moving forward, pushing through the fear and aggression. "Listen up. We're all human beings. We have a right to our truth," he shouted, trying to get into the minds of his colleagues. "Don't let hate divide us." But, as before, his words were drowned in deafening silence. The policemen seemed focused only on carrying out their orders, their faces adamant, and desperation welled up inside Mark. He realized that he was the only policeman who was trying to stem this tide of violence. Suddenly, he saw one of the police officers swoop down on a protester with a baton. It was a moment when time stood still. Mark realized it was now or never. He lunged forward, throwing his arms out as if trying to stop it all physically. "No! Stop! This is wrong!" he shouted, rushing toward his colleague, who didn't seem to hear him. The crowd of protesters became agitated. One of them shouted, "He's ours! He's on our side!" At this point, the tension reached its limit. The entire crowd, full of anger and determination, rose to his defense. Mark felt their power flowing through him, filling him with determination and courage. He realized that if they united, they could do something important. "We're not just against you. We're for our lives. For our children," shouted one of the protesters, and his words echoed in the hearts of all who heard them. These words were the catalyst that ignited the flame of unity. The protesters began to huddle together, creating a protective circle around Mark. He knew that in their hands was a powerful force that could change everything. At this point, the officers finally realized that the situation was getting out of control. They began to slow their movements, and that gave Mark a chance. He stepped forward and raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. "We're here to end the violence. We can do it together." But the silence he expected did not come. Instead, it was as if a storm had swept over the crowd. Shouts erupted, and the protesters began to voice their demands. Mark knew this was their chance. This was their only chance to unite and bring about change. Suddenly the police began to back away, puzzled by the way the protesters were uniting against the violence. It was a sign that the fear that had kept them in check was beginning to subside. Mark felt a flame of hope ignite in his chest. With every moment, with every breath, he felt that this was not just a massacre. It was a struggle for the right to be heard, for the opportunity to change their destinies. In his heart, he believed that, despite the darkness, every man had the right to his truth. And as he raised his hands to the sky, he felt that on his shoulders lay the responsibility not only for himself, but for everyone who had ever suffered violence and injustice. This was their battle, their moment, and he was willing to stand by them until the end. With a bold look at his colleagues, he realized that this choice would not be easy, but he knew there was no other way. Now he was not only a policeman, he was a protector, and he was ready to change his fate and the fate of those around him. With these thoughts he stepped forward, and this night full of fear and pain suddenly found new hope. The silence that followed his words was deafening. Mark felt all eyes on him, full of anger and fear. The crowd of protesters waited eagerly for his next word, and the police officers, as if frozen in anticipation, didn't know how to react. He knew that the moment when he could influence the course of events had come, and it was now or never. We are all here to make this world a better place," he exclaimed, feeling his voice grow more and more confident. "Violence will not solve our problem. We must talk, not fight." His words seemed to resonate with the protesters, and there were shouts of approval among them, but the police remained wary, and sparks of aggression still flashed in their eyes. Mark realized that time was running out. He had to act. Gathering all his courage, he stepped closer to the police line whose faces were shrouded in emotionless masks. This step was a challenge. He could not afford to step back without good reason. "We are all human beings, regardless of the color of our skin. We can only be strong together," he said, looking around at the protesters and police officers, trying to connect with everyone. "This hatred is killing us." But his words, as before, collided with the coldness in the eyes of his colleagues. One of them, the one who had first swung at the teenager, growled, "You forget who you are. Mark, you're a cop. We're supposed to uphold the law." These words reflected the darkness that hung over the whole situation. Mark felt anger boiling up inside him, but he knew that to respond to hatred with hatred was to give in. He took a deep breath and said, "The law? What law do we defend when it causes suffering? It's not law, it's arbitrary." At that moment a loud shout erupted from the crowd, and one of the protesters, in tears and with a trembling voice, shouted out, "We just want to be heard. We want our lives to matter." These words seemed to break an invisible barrier. There was movement in the crowd. People began to move closer to the policemen. They were not going to back down. It was more than a protest, it was a need for justice, for understanding, and now no one wanted to hide behind masks and shields. The situation escalated. The policemen, having given in to their aggression, began to huddle together, preparing to attack. Mark realized that they could ignite the fire of conflict at any moment. This was their last chance. He raised his hands again, as if to call for calm. "Let's talk. We can solve this peacefully," he shouted, his voice breaking through the hum. Suddenly he saw his colleagues' faces show signs of doubt. There was a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes, which meant that there was still hope. One of the officers, a senior officer, turned his attention to him. Mark sensed how this moment could change everything. "Mark, you know what we have to do," the older man said, his voice full of irritation, but with a touch of doubt. Mark realized that this was his moment to raise his voice and defend not only the protesters, but also his colleagues who may have still been able to find their humanity. "We have to remember why we became policemen," he shouted. "We protect people, not destroy their lives. It is our job to be protectors, not aggressors." Mark's words began to touch hearts. The protesters began to chant, "We are for peace. We are for life." This new manifesto resounded with such power that it became a mantra. The entire crowd, including protesters and police officers, seemed to freeze, waiting to see what would happen next. The faces of his colleagues began to change. Glimmers of understanding began to appear in their eyes. Maybe this was the path they had been looking for, the path to reconciliation. Mark glanced at the crowd again and, gathering all his resolve, said, "We're all here for one purpose, to life, to humanity. We can create a new reality if we work together." With every word he spoke, he could feel the tension gradually dissipating. People began to unite, and hopeful smiles appeared on their faces. This was the turning point, when fear began to give way to courage. The protesters and the police began to come together, and things looked different now. Hatred and division began to give way to understanding and sympathy. Mark realized that they could create something new if they were willing to compromise. And in that moment among the crowd, echoing above the thunder, his voice became a symbol of hope. The people began to realize they were not enemies. This was their fight for truth, and only together could they win it. Mark felt that he wasn't just a cop, he was a human being, and that was what gave him the strength to continue. He knew this was only the beginning of their long journey, but a spark of faith was lit in his heart. Faith that despite the darkness, they could find the light. The night began to dissipate, and the first light of dawn slowly crept through the clouds. The protesters and police stood in silence, as if united by a common purpose, allowing a glimmer of hope to permeate the atmosphere. Mark felt a realization ripening in his heart. This moment could be the beginning of something great, if they were all willing to keep moving forward. "We're here to listen to each other," he said, his voice sounding confident but with the warmth needed to build trust. "This is the time to hear our stories and understand each other." His words echoed in the air and the crowd began to react. The protesters began to raise their hands, asking the police officers questions, and this created a dialogical space that was sorely lacking. Mark watched as the senior officers looked at each other with incomprehension and then began to take steps towards each other. "We all want security, but how can we get it?" said one of the young police officers, his voice shaking with excitement. "How can we protect our children and your children?" This was the beginning of a true dialogue. The protesters began to tell their stories of fear and how violence and bias had ruined their lives. They shared their experiences of how their judgments were based on the color of their skin rather than their personalities. Mark listened intently, feeling his own heart fill with compassion. Each story was like a stab to the soul. He saw how many of his colleagues were also beginning to realize that their actions could do more harm than good. It was important not only to uphold the law, but also to protect the people they were called to serve. "I know some of us may seem callous, but we're all going through this, too," the senior officer said, his voice full of sincerity. "We're all just people, and we all have families. We want our children to grow up in a safe world." This recognition was the key moment. As he saw the fear and hatred begin to give way to mutual understanding, Mark could feel the energy in the crowd grow. Now they could see each other as people, not enemies. "If we want change, we have to start with ourselves," said one of the protesters, his voice full of power. "We have to accept each other for who we are and work together to create a world where everyone is safe." The crowd received this statement with approval, and Mark felt that this moment had become a landmark. Every story, every look, every smile became the building blocks of a new reality. Mark looked around and saw his colleagues starting to discuss ideas about how police practices could be improved. They talked about training, about teaching a culture of diversity, about creating special programs to build trust between the police and the community. These ideas, once seemingly impossible, were now taking shape. "We can change the approach," suggested one police officer. "We can create community programs where residents can get involved in safety issues." These words elicited shouts of approval, and the crowd finally felt that their voices were being heard. This dialogue was the beginning of a real unification, in which each side was ready to take a step forward. In that moment, Mark realized that they were all part of one big community. Each person had their own story, their own truth, and if they could share it, they could create a world where hate had no power. As dawn slowly rose over the horizon, parting the darkness, Mark felt that they had not just begun a dialogue, they had begun a journey to understanding, to cooperation, and to redemption. He knew it wouldn't be an easy road, but now that fear had given way to hope, he was ready to move forward. "Today we are all together, and this is just the beginning," he said, looking at the people around him. "We can create a safe and just world if we work together." Those words were the beginning of a new phase in their lives, and as he looked into the hopeful faces, he realized that they could all be part of something bigger. It wasn't just forgiveness, it was a new beginning, and he was ready to take on that responsibility. As soon as the sun rose above the horizon, Mark felt his heart filled with new strength. It was a time of change, and he was determined to continue this fight for truth and justice. After the light of dawn finally broke through the clouds, the atmosphere in the square became lighter and more hopeful. The protesters and the police, united in one common endeavor, began to exchange contacts, indicating a willingness to cooperate. This move symbolized their common goal of creating a safe and just community. Mark felt his heart fill with enthusiasm. He knew that this was a pivotal moment for all of them, and the opportunity to make a difference was real. People began to organize themselves into small groups, discussing how they could create a program that would help rebuild trust between the police and the citizens. "We have to start with the basics," said one local activist. "Organize meetings where people can share their experiences. This will help the police to better understand what the people in our neighborhood are facing." Agreement and support echoed through the crowd, and Mark, buoyed by their energy, began to help organize the groups. Each of them shared their experiences, and soon the discussion turned to concrete actions they could take together. Among the many ideas that emerged were suggestions for a dialogue group that would meet once a month to discuss the challenges faced by both sides. This would create an opportunity for police officers to hear the stories of the people they are called to protect, and for residents to hear about how the police work and how they can work together for common safety. Finally, Mark raised his hand, drawing attention. "We need to create a platform where everyone can voice their opinions and for the police to respond openly," he suggested. feeling the excitement gripping everyone present. It will be a place where we can work on problems and solutions together without hiding our heads in the sand. The crowd began to nod their heads in approval. Sparks of hope lit up in their eyes, and they realized that this new approach to interaction could change their lives. Someone from the protesters, a woman with bright eyes, approached Mark. "I never thought police officers could be so open to dialogue. It's important for our community," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. Mark smiled back, feeling the weight that had been weighing on his shoulders for so long begin to recede. The realization grew in his heart that change was possible, and that they, as humans, were capable of great things. Soon after they began discussing ideas, the crowd grew and new faces began arriving at the square. People from neighboring areas, local leaders, and even a few journalists came to see what was happening. Mark could feel the support for their movement growing, and it filled him with hope. "A new movement is being born here today," he said, turning to the crowd. "We are on the threshold of a change that can improve our society. Let's do it together." These words caused a storm of emotion. People began to applaud and the atmosphere was filled with laughter and joy. With each new day, they were getting closer to their goal of creating a space where everyone would feel heard and safe. After several hours of discussion and exchange of ideas, they came to the decision to hold the first dialogue group meeting the following Thursday. Mark promised that he would be present to support his colleagues and do his best to strengthen the link between the police and the community. But deep down, he realized that this was only the beginning. Despite his bright hopes and aspirations, there was a long way to go to overcome years of preconceptions and fears. He had his doubts, but he knew that together they could create something wonderful. When he got home, a smile rose to his face. He saw his family and neighbors begin to change their attitudes toward the police, and this was an important step in their development as a community. There was hope in his heart, and even though there were challenges ahead, he was ready to fight for justice. By evening, Mark sat down at his laptop again and began writing on his blog about what had happened during the day. He knew that these words could inspire others and help them realize that change is possible if people come together for a common goal. And finally, he could be proud to be a part of the process. With every word he wrote, he felt the world around him change. His faith in humanity was returning, and in that moment he realized that his life and the lives of the people he was protecting were now forever linked. It was a story of struggle, of reconciliation and, most importantly, of hope for a future they could all build together. Bright Thursday came quickly, and the atmosphere in the city changed. What had only recently seemed possible in dreams was now taking shape. The dialogue group was preparing for its first meeting. Mark felt excitement, but there was also hope within him. This was a time when words would become actions and actions would become change. The gathering was planned in the square where the protest took place. As the morning progressed, the crowd began to grow and by noon people began to arrive, including locals, activists and police officers. Mark, who had spent a lot of time the day before planning the details, felt the tension build as he saw familiar faces ready to dialogue. Some of his colleagues at the police station looked wary, while others were more open-minded. But one man stood out among them, Lieutenant Chris, who had always considered himself an uncompromising advocate of order and brutality. His reaction to what was happening could have a significant impact on how the meeting would go. "I don't see why we have to do this, Mark," Chris said as they met at the entrance. His voice was full of frustration. "We're here to enforce order, not to talk about sensitive subjects. It's only going to cause trouble." "Chris, we need to understand what we're doing," Mark replied, trying to remain calm. "If we don't start listening to people, we will never be able to build trust with them." Chris snorted, but didn't continue the argument. The situation was tense enough, and he probably didn't want to look even more stubborn in front of his colleagues. Nevertheless, his hesitation reflected the general discontent among some of the officers. Not everyone was ready to accept the new methods. As the meeting began, Mark stepped forward and, gathering his thoughts, spoke up. "We are here today to listen to each other and find common ground. It will not be easy, but we must keep an open mind. We want to create a safe and respectful society for all." Those gathered began to exchange opinions. At first the conversations were cautious, but soon participants began to share their stories and experiences. It was not easy to hear these personal stories, but they created a sense of community. One of the first to speak was James, a local activist. His voice shook with excitement, but he continued, I see police officers attacking people for simply looking different. It's not just an experience, it's my life. I can't take it anymore." These words elicited a strong reaction in the crowd. Some whispered yes in support, while others shouted in indignation. Mark felt the tension building. The cops were clearly unhappy, especially Chris, who began exchanging unhappy glances with his colleagues. Nevertheless, Mark continued to manage the meeting, urging everyone to remain calm. He realized that this dialogue could be the bridge they had been looking for so long. "It is important that we not only talk, but also listen," he added. "Let's try to understand each other, even if it is not easy." But as soon as one of the officers, another police officer, raised his hand, the situation changed dramatically. "You all talk about hating the police, but why don't you talk about those who break the law?" he exclaimed, his voice full of aggression. "We risk our lives to protect you." The hall froze. Many participants began to whisper, creating waves of excitement. The escalation of the situation was obvious. Mark quickly tried to regain control. "We are not here to argue, but to understand. Let's continue to discuss our feelings and experiences." But it didn't work. One of the protesters stood up, his face contorted with anger. "You don't understand. It's not just about the law. It's about life and death. We're tired of being afraid," he shouted, pointing at the officers. "You can't just ignore our suffering." These words were the trigger. Tension was building, and soon the crowd began to exchange insults. The police officers began to put their hands on their shoulders, preparing for conflict. Mark knew that in this chaos the situation could get out of control. He raised his hands, trying to calm the crowd. "Let's take a step back. It's only fueling the hatred," he said, trying to keep his balance. "We should be working together, not against each other." But his voice was almost drowned in the general hum. Chris, standing in the background, looked at Mark with contempt. "Watch how this ends," he said quietly, but Mark heard. He realized that the future of their interaction would depend on how they handled this moment. Finally, the excitement peaked. The crowd began to sway, and Mark realized that without action, the situation could get out of control. "Everyone here, we can make a difference," he shouted, trying to get attention. "This is not a time for hate. This is a time for understanding. Let's pause, take a step back and remember why we are here." Some began to slow their steps, but many remained hostile. Suddenly, there was a loud shout from the crowd, and one of the protesters seemed about to lunge at the policeman. Mark, instinctively realizing that this situation could erupt into violence, rushed forward. His heart pounded as he screamed, "Stop! Don't do it! It won't solve anything." In that moment, as the world around him became more and more chaotic, Mark felt forces uniting. Hope and fear mingled in his heart. He knew they were on the verge of something important, and this was a test for everyone. Chris and the other policemen began to move forward, their eyes full of displeasure. Mark had only one chance left to convince everyone there to stop and look at what they could do together instead of fighting each other. This was the last chance to change the course of events, and now that the tension had reached its limit, he knew he had to take responsibility. This was their shared future, and they were all part of it. The situation in the square had reached its critical moment. People were shouting. Their emotions, accumulated over many years, were bursting out, and everyone seemed to be ready for a conflict. A loud roar rolled through the crowd, while Mark, trying to maintain control, stood between the protesters and the police. "Don't let hate control you," he shouted, his voice full of determination. "We are here to change what is wrong. We must understand each other, not fight." Several protesters stopped, looking at Mark with bewilderment, and he felt that this might be his only chance to get the situation back under control. "It's not just words, it's our life," he said, clenching his fists, trying to find the right words. "We all want safety. Let's take a step back and think about what we can do together. We are not enemies. We are neighbors." The crowd froze, and the anger began to subside. Mark saw a few people begin to look around, and understanding appeared in their eyes. He knew it would take a little time to rebuild the atmosphere of trust, but every step in that direction was important. "Look, I'm not saying we're perfect," he continued. "We've all made mistakes, and sometimes it's cost us too much, but we can learn from each other. We have to open our hearts and minds." Some of the police officers began to sway, and there was a trace of doubt in their eyes as well. Lieutenant Chris, standing aside, couldn't ignore what was happening. A hesitation flashed in his gaze. "Mark, do you really believe that?" he asked, loosening his aggressive posture slightly. "Can we change the way we work?" "Yes, I believe we can," Mark answered, feeling his heart fill with hope. "But it requires us to be open. We have to be willing to hear each other. It won't happen overnight, but if we start now, we have a chance to build something better." At this time, the protesters began to gather, and although some were still expressing their discontent, their shouts became quieter. People began to hear each other discussing their concerns and desires. The pain they were feeling began to intertwine with hope for change. Mark, seeing that the tension had subsided a bit, decided it was time to let people speak. He pointed to one of the microphones on the stage. "Do any of you want to share your thoughts?" he asked, trying to look as open as possible. "This is your time, your space." Some people began to rise, and soon a middle-aged woman with expressive eyes was on the stage. "I'm a mother," she began, her voice shaking. "I went through terrible things when my son had a run-in with the police. I fear for his life every day, but I'm here because I hope we can make a difference." These words struck a chord with many and the crowd began to applaud. Hearing someone open their soul was a powerful moment for everyone. A few more people stepped forward, each sharing their experiences, and gradually the atmosphere began to change. Anger and fear gave way to understanding and respect. Mark, sensing that the moment had reached its peak, turned to Chris. "Chris, maybe you'd like to say something too?" he asked, hoping that the officer could support this new endeavor. Chris hesitated for a moment, but then nodded and walked out onto the stage. "I realize that many of you have fear and distrust of the police, and rightly so, but I want you to know that we're human beings, too. We make mistakes sometimes, but we're here to protect you. Let's work hard to earn your trust." This confession was a turning point. People began to whisper, and Mark saw their fears begin to dissolve. Instead of remaining enemies, they began to work on understanding each other. The meeting continued and more people came on stage to share their thoughts and experiences. Every voice, every word contributed to rebuilding relationships and trust. After a few hours of discussion and sharing, Mark felt that they were on the way to something significant. People began to unite, and the police began to see them not just as a group of people but as real neighbors with whom they could cooperate. As the evening shadows began to envelop the square, Mark and Chris stood back, watching the meeting continue. "You really did it," Chris said, his voice softer. "I never thought it was possible." "We've all done it," Mark replied with a smile. "This is just the beginning. We still have a lot of work to do, but now we have the hope and the will to make a difference." At that moment, a new atmosphere prevailed in the square. Hope filled the hearts of the people and they began to realize that despite past mistakes and suffering, they had the opportunity to build a better future. Mark knew there would be challenges ahead, but now he was confident that they could overcome all obstacles if they worked together. In this moment full of hope and unity, he realized that love and understanding can overcome hatred and fear, and this was the most important lesson in their journey to change. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. We hope this story has touched you and sparked important conversations about understanding and empathy. We'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? Your stories are important to us and sharing them can help create understanding and change. Remember, each and every one of you is incredibly important to us and we appreciate each and every one of you. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to our channel and giving us a like so we can reach more people. Your support is very important to us. We wish you a wonderful day.